In a small village surrounded by tall, green mountains lived a young girl named Sophie. Sophie lived in a cozy wooden cottage with her grandmother. The cottage was small, but it was always full of life. There was usually the smell of baking bread, the sound of laughter, and most importantly, the steady sound of the grandmother's favorite clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was a beautiful wooden clock that hung on the wall. For 50 years, it had never stopped. It was the heart of their home. But 3 days ago, the clock suddenly stopped. The pendulum froze. The hands stuck at 4 p.m. Since the clock stopped, the house felt terrible. The silence was heavy. Sophie's grandmother sat in her armchair, looking sad and tired. She missed the rhythm of her old friend. "I have to fix it," Sophie whispered to herself. It was a cold, foggy morning. Sophie took the heavy clock off the wall. She wrapped it carefully in a thick wool blanket. She put it in her backpack, although it was very heavy for her small shoulders. She walked out of the door and looked up at the highest hill in the village. At the very top stood a crooked stone tower. Smoke was rising from the chimney. This was the home of Mr. Hugo, the old clockmaker. The villagers said he was strange. Some said he talked to his machines. Some said he was a wizard. Sophie was a little bit afraid, but she loved her grandmother too much to turn back. The walk up the hill was difficult. The wind blew against her face, and the backpack hurt her shoulders. But Sophie kept walking. Step by step, she climbed higher. Finally, she reached the top. The door of the tower was made of dark oak wood with iron hinges. Sophie took a deep breath to calm her beating heart. She knocked 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. For a moment, there was no answer. Then she heard the sound of many locks unlocking. Click, clank, thud. The door creaked open slowly. A tall man stood there. He wore a long velvet coat covered in dust. He had wild gray hair and bright, sparkling eyes. He looked at Sophie, then he looked at her heavy backpack. "You have carried a heavy burden a long way," Mr. Hugo said gently. His voice sounded like old paper rustling. "Come in out of the cold, child." Sophie stepped inside the tower. Her eyes widened in amazement. The room was huge and round. From the floor to the ceiling, the walls were covered with clocks. There were golden clocks, wooden clocks, and clocks shaped like stars and moons. The room was not quiet, but it was not noisy either. It sounded like a forest full of insects. Tick, 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 whir, click. It was a symphony of sounds. "Put it here," Mr. Hugo said, pointing to a large table in the center of the room. Sophie carefully unwrapped the wool blanket and placed her grandmother's clock on the table. "Please, sir," she said politely. "This is my grandmother's favorite clock. Since it stopped, she has been very sad. Can you fix it?" Mr. Hugo did not answer immediately. He put on a pair of strange spectacles with 3 lenses on each eye. He leaned down and looked closely at the clock. He put his ear against the wood. He closed his eyes and listened, like a doctor listening to a patient's heart. Mr. Hugo hummed. "Interesting, very interesting." "Is it broken forever?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Hugo stood up and looked at Sophie. "Mechanically, the mainspring is snapped. That is easy to fix. But there is another problem. This clock has lost its rhythm. It is tired." Sophie was confused. "Tired? But it is a machine. Machines do not get tired." Mr. Hugo smiled a warm, mysterious smile. "Ah, that is where you are wrong. A clock is not just a machine. It holds the memories of the house. It counts the happy moments and the sad moments. This clock has carried the time for your family for 50 years. It needs to be reminded of its purpose." He walked to a shelf and picked up a small set of tools. He handed them to Sophie. "I will not fix this clock," Mr. Hugo announced. Sophie felt tears in her eyes. "But why?" "Because I do not love this clock," Mr. Hugo said gently. "You do. Your grandmother does. If you want it to beat again, you must be the one to heal it. I will guide you, but your hands must do the work." Sophie looked at the small screwdrivers and tweezers in her hand. She was just a little girl. She didn't know anything about gears or springs, but she remembered her grandmother's sad face. She looked up at Mr. Hugo and nodded bravely. "I will try." Sophie climbed onto the high wooden stool. The inside of the clock lay open before her. To Sophie, it looked like a tiny, complicated golden city. There were wheels with teeth, thin springs, and tiny metal pins. "First," Mr. Hugo instructed, "we must replace the mainspring. It gives the clock energy." He placed a new, shiny metal spring on the table. It was coiled tight like a snake. Sophie picked up the tweezers. She tried to place the spring into the center of the clock, but her hands were shaking. The spring slipped and bounced across the table. Ping! Sophie tried again. She held her breath. She pushed the spring hard. It slipped again. "It is too hard!" Sophie cried out in frustration. She dropped the tweezers. "I am clumsy. I will break it more." Mr. Hugo placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "You are using only your muscles, Sophie. You are trying to force the metal. But metal is stubborn. You must use your heart." "How can I use my heart?" Sophie asked. "This is just a machine." "Close your eyes," Mr. Hugo whispered. "Do not think about the difficult screw. Think about why you are fixing this. Think about your grandmother. What is your happiest memory with her?" Sophie closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. She imagined her grandmother's kitchen. She smelled the warm cinnamon bread. She heard her grandmother laughing while they drank tea. She felt the warmth of the fireplace. A small smile appeared on Sophie's face. Her body relaxed. Her hands stopped shaking. "Now," Mr. Hugo said softly, "keep that memory in your mind. Pick up the tool." Sophie opened her eyes, but she held on to the warm feeling. She picked up the spring again. She didn't squeeze the tweezers too hard. She moved slowly and gently, as if she were holding a butterfly. She guided the spring into the tiny slot. It slid in perfectly. Click. "I did it," Sophie gasped. "Yes," Mr. Hugo nodded, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "You see, Sophie? When you work with love, your hands become steady. You have put a piece of your happiness into the clock. Now let us finish the rest." For the next hour, Sophie worked quietly next to Mr. Hugo. She cleaned the dusty gears and polished the dull wood. She placed every screw with patience and care. She kept the image of her grandmother's smile in her mind the whole time. Finally, the last piece was in place. Mr. Hugo nodded and handed Sophie a small, golden winding key. "It is time," he said. "Give it life." Sophie inserted the key into the side of the clock. She turned it 3 times. Crook, crook, crook. She stepped back and waited. For a moment there was silence. Sophie held her breath. Had she failed? Suddenly the pendulum began to swing. Swish, swish, then came the sound. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was strong and steady. In fact, it sounded even better than before. The beat was happier, like a strong heartbeat. "You did it," Mr. Hugo said softly. "You fixed the machine, but you also healed its spirit." Sophie packed the clock back into her bag. Strangely, the heavy backpack now felt light as a feather. She thanked Mr. Hugo and ran down the hill. She did not feel the cold wind. She only felt excitement. When she opened the door to her cottage, her grandmother was still sitting in the armchair, looking at the empty wall. "Grandma," Sophie cheered, "look!" Sophie hung the clock back on the nail. The familiar tick-tock immediately filled the room. The grandmother looked up. Her eyes widened, and a beautiful smile appeared on her face. The tiredness seemed to leave her body. "Oh, Sophie," her grandmother said, hugging her tight. "The house feels alive again." Sophie hugged her back. She looked at the old clock ticking steadily on the wall. She realized Mr. Hugo's secret was true. The clock didn't just tell the time. It told the story of their love. And as long as they cared for it, it would never truly stop.